taking place today. The first panel focused on the organization and funding and infrastructure for science in a genetic age. This panel is focused on the information infrastructure and some of the policy infrastructure, particularly pertaining to intellectual property in a genetic age. The overall rubric for this series of panels is based on the following observation, that somehow with the completion of the mapping of the human genome, with a shift towards different models and approaches to research, somehow how we manage and organize and support research needs to shift. And so this is, as I say, one in a series of 4 panels to inform that. My name's Robert Mittman, and I will be moderating this and the other panels today. Before we get started with this panel, there are a couple of people and organizations that I would like to acknowledge, and in particular, this series has been convened and is sponsored by the AAAS, and I'd like to recognize Barbara Jasny, who has been instrumental in putting it together for the association, and also by Affymetrix, and I'd like to recognize Katie Buck from Affymetrix, who also has worked, has toiled mightily to bring all of the people here together. What I would like to do is first just to introduce the panelists that we have here, and then also to say a little bit about the format for today. On your far left is Carol Kovac. Carol directs IBM's life sciences activities, and so they have a range of both hardware, software, and service businesses that are oriented towards the life sciences, really at all phases of their development. And she'll say a little bit more about that activity. To Carol's left is Alan Herbert. Alan works in genetics and genomics at Boston University, and in particular is responsible there for the activities in the Framingham Heart Study. And so has thought a lot about the kinds of infrastructure and practices and approaches that are necessary to make complex multi-site research function correctly. To Alan's left is Yochai Benkler. Yochai is a law professor at Yale University, and his concern there is on intellectual property, and in particular intellectual property in areas of shared intellectual property, and has looked a lot at open source software, and thought about the applications of these open source models to biological research. And then finally, on Yochai's left, on your far right, is Phil McGarrigle. Phil is also concerned with intellectual property. He is the IP lawyer for Affymetrix, and so is really in the trenches, on the ground, trying to make sure at the same time that as Affymetrix's intellectual property is protected, that the sharing of knowledge is as wide as possible, so that the technology can be properly and widely applied. Let me say a bit about the format today. Unlike a lot of scientific panels, this is not going to be a series of 4 30-minute PowerPoint presentations all crammed into 90 minutes with another half hour for questions and answers. Not a lot of speed talking will go on here. Instead, what we're aiming for is a very interactive kind of session. And so the panel and I are going to engage in a conversation. And at some point, I'll come out to you in the audience with my trusty wireless handheld mic and invite you into the conversation. So to start the conversation, I guess what I'd like to do is maybe begin by reporting a little bit of what went on in the last panel, the panel that was focused on organization and funding of science. If there were a couple of conclusions that I could draw from that, they were the following. I guess first that the need for and practice of collaboration in medical, healthcare, and even basic genetic research is large and growing. And so that the pattern of research that we will see, in addition to the traditional investigator-initiated, fairly fragmented research, is increasingly going to be for larger collaborations, cross-organizational, cross-disciplinary collaborations. That has some fairly interesting and I think important implications for the conduct of science and the way that the activities of science are paid for and otherwise rewarded, that have some pretty significant bearings on the work of this panel. Number one, for instance, if we're collaborating across many organizations, the risk of fragmentation and compartmentalization is great. Or maybe what I should say is the tendency to continue our old habits of working in silos, of having our own proprietary databases and information infrastructure, of keeping our biospecimens and tissue samples fairly close to the vest so that we can make sure that we've got access to them, are likely to continue. And yet, if we're going to have effective research, somehow we have to cross those silos. We've got to break those silos. So that's a first line of inquiry that we'll take with the panel. The second observation that comes from this kind of multidisciplinary, multi-organization, in some case multi-sectoral research, as we've got collaborations that cross government labs, industry labs, and academia, not to mention foundations, is that the ownership of the intellectual property that results is tangled. Actually, the way I should put it is that in the past, the desire to possess and control that intellectual property has acted as a break, as an impediment to some collaborations happening. And so a second line of inquiry that we'll pursue today is just how will our practices around intellectual property evolve to support innovation, to support collaboration. Before I launch into some questions to the panel, though, about that, one observation that I made at the beginning of the last panel that I've got to repeat here is that where you stand on issues depends a whole lot on where you sit. And so what I'd like to do is to ask the panel to begin with, just to tell us a little bit more about where you sit and how you expect that to affect where you're going to stand today. Carol, maybe I'll ask you to begin.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Is this on? People in the back can hear me? Yeah, okay. So some of you in the room may be wondering a little bit about, why is IBM sitting up here in this particular panel? And as Robert said, I had a group at IBM called Healthcare and Life Sciences. This is a group that we started about 5-6 years ago from a business perspective. We had for a long time in our research organization a group doing computational biology research and collaborating with academic work around the world. But about 6 years ago, we said, this is really the kind of convergence. What's happening in biology is creating the opportunity to really see new markets in information technology. And so we launched a business which in 2000, I would say, was probably, we thought was going to be primarily about high performance computing and a new market for scientific and technical computing. What we found out is that, in fact, that the much greater challenges beyond, just sort of getting enough processing power, that actually wasn't even the challenge that most of our clients, both in the commercial space and also people in the academic and basic research space, told us, it's not about, power to crunch the numbers. What it really is about the fact that we have so much data, not just volume of data, but the heterogeneity of data and the distributed nature of it. It's coming from different places, and how do you control it, and how do you manage the combination of sort of technically managing data, and then also the question of sort of the quality, managing the quality, annotations, if you will. So how do you do that? And then, and then others came to us and said, and it isn't just about, don't think it's just about structured data. It's also about, the tremendous amount of unstructured data that's out there in the form of scientific papers, text-based. And when you start to talk about healthcare, looking at just written physician notes, for example. So that really became, for us, a much larger and more interesting, in some ways, problem for IBM to focus on. And I would just kind of close I know you wanted this to be short, but I would just close by saying that in the beginning, we were very focused on kind of the research community, basic science and research in the life sciences. What we also have come to see in the 6 years we've been doing this is that we have seen a much faster progression to medical research, and what we believe will translate, I'll say quickly, but maybe I'm being a little optimistic, but I'm going to challenge all of us to say quickly, to actually producing better diagnostics and better therapies for patient care. So we have come very much at IBM to believe in what we call information-based medicine, which will in fact be a very new set of capabilities that can be practiced in medicine, not just in basic science. And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about how information will change that.
Good, thank you. Alan?
Hi, I think we live in a golden age right now. I think over the next decade or so, we're going to end up understanding the essence of what it is to be human. We're 99.9% identical in our genetic code, one to two differences per 1,000 bases. And, just in the same way that it was exciting when Columbus discovered America, all that's been done. I think we now have the tools to actually understand the essence of being human. And, we have a unique period in time where we have a convergence of lots of technologies, such as Carol has just described. And we have a unique collection of data sets collected on humans, populations over the last 10 to 50 years using good technologies. And we have the human genome sequence, and we have a reference to go from. And so what I'm doing at Boston University is I'm working in the Department of Genetics and Genomics, and we are using the technologies developed by Affymetrix, which allows you to look at all these differences, thousands at a time, in a single experiment. So you can map these differences on an individual basis very quickly, very efficiently. And we're using that to study the Framingham heart study population. The study was begun in 1948. It's made a huge number of contributions to the medical literature and to concepts of disease risk. And we want to build on that and take it further to the genetic stage and understand the genetic risk factors that contribute to disease, the pathways that are involved, and potentially identify targets. And we're slightly different from a lot of other approaches. We're looking at normal population. We're looking at normal human variation, believing that will translate into risk of disease. And we're able to do that in Framingham and look at multiple phenotypes at the same time. Everyone's come to many repeated visits over 2 to 4 years apart. They've had lots of different parameters measured, and we can take those and correlate those with genetic variation, and we hope to identify those variations which carry significant risk of disease that way.
Thanks. Yochai?
I've been spending, is that too loud? Much too loud now. I've been spending the past decade or so looking at the ways in which non-proprietary approaches or commons-based approaches to all sorts of production problems or provisioning problems can be implemented, can be more efficient in a variety of domains affected by the introduction of the internet. I did a good bit of work on wireless communications, on what now we recognize as Wi-Fi. That is to say, an equipment market based on a commons in spectrum, as opposed to what was commonly done in the mid-90s, which is to think that what we need to move is to a strong property auction-based system in spectrum. And obviously spent a lot of time looking at regulation of information and innovation through things like patents, copyrights, and similar rights in digital materials. About 5 or 6 years ago, I started looking at the extent to which open source software should not be seen as a software development methodology, but an innovation methodology that reorganizes itself around different models of sharing inputs and outputs of innovation, and how you actually change the mix from the classic model of strong appropriation, you invest, then you have people pay for access, as opposed to models that are based more on material sales and service relationships, but the innovation itself goes on in a sharing model. And then in the past, I'd say 2 or 3 years, following an invitation from Rockefeller Foundation to talk to a bunch of their grantees who are looking at issues of food security and access to medicines, started looking more closely at the extent to which we could actually apply what we have seen and learned in software, in other digital media, to the much more complex areas of biotechnology, both for agriculture and for medicine. And I've spent a good bit of time now looking at university licensing policies and the extent to which we could work with these, working with the BIOS initiative to create an open source biological innovation system for agricultural biotech that just came out with the first set of technologies that would be put in this last week in an article in Nature. And that's where I've been, that's where I come from on this.
Good, thank you. Phil?
Unlike Carol, it's probably no surprise that you have an Affymetrix patent attorney up here on this panel. I spend most of my time getting patents as opposed to, open source issues, but the getting of the patents in Affymetrix's area is important because it's a fairly narrowly described area. So it probably fits a little bit better than some of the larger fragmented areas that Robert was speaking about. And so in my day-to-day activities, we go through procuring patents, we go through, patent maintenance and licensing efforts and all those things that normally flow from obtaining patents. And so we would look to the protection that we would approach it in terms of getting protection for various inventions in a variety of different fields, and exploring policy issues with respect to other areas that might help us out as well.
Good.
That's about it.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to come back to that question of fragmentation. And Carol, I thank you for expanding the scope beyond research also to talk about healthcare delivery, which if anything, is even more fragmented than medical research is. And so, as I said earlier, just as the organizations for medical research are fragmented, so too are their information infrastructure, at least to date. First question, I guess, is one of just sort of maybe taking the temperature, doing some kind of a situation analysis, and just how fragmented is it today, and does that seem to you to be an impediment in the conduct, and especially, as you say, the translation of research into clinically useful diagnostics and therapeutics?
So I think it's still highly fragmented. This is a huge area of work, and when you say how fragmented is it, let me say what I mean when I'm talking about it. I think, you know, if you look at, for example, the way clinical data are collected in the course of a clinical trial, for example, first of all, in large measure, a lot of that is still paper-based, despite the fact that we've talked for years now about moving from paper to electronic data capture in clinical trials. We're still looking at predominantly paper-based data capture in clinical trials. You can't begin to start to, I mean, I have all kinds of ways as an information technologist to connect different kinds of electronic data to one another. I have XML, I have web services, I have, you know, ways to make stuff work together today that I didn't maybe have 10 years ago or 20 years ago when we talked about, you know, plug and play kinds of object-oriented technologies. But if it's not in electronic form, that's not going to help. So I think that, you know, one of our challenges is moving data from paper to electronic, and of course in the not even in the trials area, but in the general clinical care area, that's even worse. I mean, there's the penetration of electronic medical records, at least in this country, is still pretty small. Now, we see that is changing, and we do see, you know, that one of the large areas of adoption, it's not maybe really taken off yet, but, you know, we are placing a bet on the idea that it will start to really grow in the next couple of years, is the adoption of electronic medical records, and coupled with that, electronic data capture in the medical space. Already we're seeing in imaging, for example, that moving imaging data and building sort of large electronic libraries of imaging, that's really well underway. The fragmentation, I mean, we still have lots of, I mean, one of the dangers is that there aren't a set of common standards. Lots of people are working on standards. Standards can kind of be a big, slow thing to get done. And it's one area where some of the things we've seen in the last 12 months or so from the US federal government around starting to drive interoperability standards in healthcare, I think could be a huge impetus if the government really, really sort of has a will to continue that. And, you know, cynics might question that will, looking at kind of the federal budget associated with it. But, you know, but I myself am optimistic that we're kind of entering an era where a lot of the pieces of what I'll call infrastructure, I don't mean the, you know, the network, but I mean, you know, the ways that you get interoperability to happen between different silos of data, and then also the tools that you use to work on that, that's going to get laid in place, that infrastructure will get laid in place over the next 3 years. And as soon as it does, I'm totally convinced that value will come out of it, high value will come out of it.
Alan, you're close to the ground here in that clinical research. What's your assessment of it?
Well, I think that there's a tendency for institutions to lock off their databases and their medical records from the point of view that they turn out to be real assets. Once you have those in place, then you can write grants around those particular records and expand them and generate more money, it becomes like an investment in itself that you can curate and make more money from. And it's not normally described that way, and there are a lot of other positive motivations associated with it, but that's one of the ways of describing it. And so there's a huge incentive not to open up your databases to other people or share, because potentially that's a loss of your unique resource. And so I think that the efforts that have been taken by the federal government, by NHLBI, to kind of create common data sets that are available for investigators from other institutions who are qualified, and through HIPAA as well. You know, I think HIPAA generally is criticized quite, the Health Insurance Portability Act is criticized for all the burden that it places on various research procedures and all that kind of stuff. But in essence, once the electronic standards are available to transfer data, then a lot of things become possible that wouldn't be possible otherwise.
Let me just interject and clarify on HIPAA. HIPAA is as you say, it's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of
1996, and implemented in April 2003.
That's right. Implemented, and as one of its provisions, it said that any healthcare provider who is getting funding from government payers, in other words, almost every healthcare provider, will submit data electronically. And so it was a strong impetus towards the development of this electronic infrastructure. And along with it, it had some very strict privacy provisions for protecting the private information of patients. Privacy provisions which, from the point of view of researchers, have acted in some ways as a brake, as an impediment for being able to combine records from a single patient longitudinally, for example, or records from a single patient who may have seen multiple providers.
Oh, that's only partially true. There's two categories of data set. One's a de-identified data set where a lot of the identifiers are taken out in terms of date of birth and sequence of events and all that type of stuff. And that's true. Those data sets are very limited and difficult to do research on. They do have the strength, though. It provides an external way of evaluating how well an institution is doing. You know, can it measure blood pressure? Can it measure glucose? You can take that information and you can do your statistics on it and say, yeah, these guys know what they're doing. No, don't bother with their data set. So it does have that positive point of view. What's more interesting, it allows for a limited data release set that's associated with the data distribution agreement, and that's what we're doing our study in Framingham under, is a data distribution agreement. Framingham is not covered by HIPAA because there's no money involved. It's not a covered entity. It's excluded, but there's still the same kind of data distribution set involved, and essentially the investigator has to sign that. And I think one of the unintended consequences that could come out of that is that they actually develops a program where people get licensed as and that the licenses, they've signed this data distribution agreement, and so therefore they should have access to all these data sets, you know, rather than doing it on a case-by-case basis. You know, once you can get a license to have a gun, and you can do a lot more harm with the gun to other human beings than doing research on partially de-identified data sets. And so these data sets will be a lot more useful, and you know, once they're transportable, it will mean that an investigator anywhere, once they're licensed to do it, whatever that licensing process is, will be able to work. So I think HIPAA is causing people to rethink how to do things, but I think it, with some redirection, it could help out very well. And the other thing.
So if we outlaw data sharing, only outlaws will share data. Is that?
Yeah, and
Yochai,
it's important to focus. I'm sorry. There's one aspect of what Alan focused on, which is we tend to think of intellectual property. We tend to think of, but there's an aspect of this that has to do with the structure of funding and the structure of recognition and respect within research that still is very resistant to this notion of liquid data in an ocean that you just you're valuable for inserting into it as opposed to being able to identify discrete bodies of information, writing grants on them, getting promoted on them. And if you look at things like how much credit can you get for annotating something that you then put in HapMap, or for sequencing a set of genes, is that really what you want a grad student to be doing? Is that really what you want to do at a particular stage of a career? Or are you looking to create more stable sets that you can then publish analyses on? Even though if we look back and we talk back on fragmentation, how we actually develop knowledge best, it would be everybody throwing whatever they can as quickly as they can into a big ocean, and then everybody else pulling and everybody doing what they do best. But that makes it very difficult with the mechanisms we have today to recognize effort, to fund it, irrespective of intellectual property, within the publicly funded and university-based system.
Yeah, my feeling is that everyone looks at what they're losing. They don't look at what they're gaining. So I lose information on 1,000 SNPs, and I throw it into the HapMap project. The next thing I know, I have 1.6 million SNPs to work with. And then that data is available to me, just because I contributed it to that data doesn't mean I say I can't analyze it. And suddenly I have a much bigger scope of data to analyze. And I think that's a win-win situation. I've given a little and I've got a lot back. And what's limiting me is not the data, but what I can do with the data. And what I can do with the data is much more, because there's much more of it to analyze.
But I do think it's more profound than sort of the individual recognizing the value in sort of expanded access to data. I think, and I'm sure Ann Barker talked a little bit about this, but, she and I had the opportunity to talk yesterday about, about this issue of the culture of science that is really around sort of small groups, individual investigators, and the need to kind of hold data in a kind of closed, siloed, or proprietary model. I would agree with you, Joachim, that all of the reward systems are lined up around that. Maybe not all, but most of the really good reward systems are lined up around that. And until we really start to look, we've at IBM done a lot of work with open source communities in the software area. And we've asked ourselves, and you might look at that and say, gosh, IBM, who had like the biggest software development projects, procedural kind of development environments of anybody in the world, right, would be the last one you would think would really embrace something like Linux, right? Penguins are our best friend, and so how did that happen? We really looked at that and said, first of all, this is a powerful model, but what's so powerful about it is the fact that it embraces a culture that actually rewards people within that culture for contributing and not for holding back. And so I think that you really have to look at the deeper issues of that, and perhaps in some respects in biology, we look at, the kinds of public data sources, et cetera. That's a good thing. That says that there are cultural changes happening. But I think it's very, very, a very profound change that has to happen in the culture of how science gets done, and that's hard to do.
I'd like to hold off the conversation on open source for
Sorry,
a little bit later,
okay.
and come back a little to some of the pragmatics of healthcare research and delivery. And we were starting to go there, talking about the institutional fragmentation, the sense that, gee, if I have a body of data that has value, I control it, I can derive that value. To that, I might add a fairly persistent, not invented here syndrome in a lot of different research shops that say, gee, we've built ourselves a data management system that works great for us, and why should we change it? Because it works great. Coming to healthcare delivery, the fragmentation there is astounding. In 1994, 2/3 of doctors were in solo or two-doc practices. Really too small of a unit to be very sophisticated for buying information systems, let alone for being at the edge on new clinical practices. Now, after a dozen years of extreme consolidation through the entire physician system, it's gone from 2/3 in tiny practices down to 60% in tiny practices. In other words, the needle has barely moved. And so my question then is about how do we actually move to this world, Carol, that you're describing, where the use of an electronic medical record is common, and where the information standards across them are common, so that information actually can be shared? Because, as Carol kind of touched on at the side, it's not that we lack information standards in healthcare information systems. It's actually more the opposite. We've got a surfeit of standards. The problem is they're mutually overlapping and mutually incompatible, and we've got kind of non-standard standards, if you will. So to come to your forecast of, in 3 years this will be in more common use across healthcare delivery and research. Tell me some more about the mechanism by which we can resolve those differences in that short amount of time.
So as one of my colleagues said, the nice thing about standards is there's so many to choose from. And so that is certainly true in healthcare, and in sort of seems to be coming also true in the biosciences. In healthcare, on the clinical side, I think, it's a really hard problem, and there's a lot of people who have said to me, who are more skeptical perhaps than I am about how fast we'll really gain adoption of electronic technologies in sort of general practice in healthcare. They would say, we've had electronic medical records for 20 years, and people have been talking about the adoption of those for that long, and it still hasn't happened. One of my venture capital friends said, let's face it, healthcare is the boneyard for information technology companies. Kind of a scary thought. But I think there's a couple of things that I see that are driving forces for change. And kind of ironically enough, I think one of them is the increasing pressure, the squeeze that healthcare providers are finding themselves in today around cost and efficiency. And the fact is that, in every other industry, we have found ways to, by moving from paper-based systems to electronic systems, to increase efficiency, increase productivity, increase the quality of output, while simultaneously decreasing cost. And I think you can point to many, many, many places where IT has unarguably done that in lots of other industries, not yet in healthcare. And that's what we're kind of betting on, that we can take a lot of the learnings that we've gotten from other places about supply chain, about customer relationship management, or here you might think about it as patient relationship management, and apply those into healthcare, albeit there's some unique features there. Start to apply those into healthcare, and really then I think one aspect of that is moving healthcare from more of a craft-based kind of mentality to one that really does drive around some standards. I think one of the other big driving forces could be quality, because we all know the Institute of Medicine study. I mean, not everybody agrees with the numbers, but whether you believe it's 45,000 or 100,000 people that die every year, in this country from preventable medical error, that is an appalling number. 100,000 people is like crashing an airplane once a week, a big airplane with full of people, right? And so, and if we had a transportation system that had a record like that, we'd probably shut all the airports down until we figured out what the heck was going wrong. So, so quality could become, if we, if the federal government chooses to put some muscle behind that, could become a really significant driving force, I think, for the adoption of electronic records, because the only way you're going to get to, to quality outcomes is to be able to get the measurements to happen. You can't do that if you can't, gain access to the data, and you can't do that if it's all locked up in those file folders on the wall. So those are a couple of thoughts about why I think change is coming.
Yeah, so I guess if we carry the airline metaphor a little further, we'd end up with 10 health systems, 5 of which were in bankruptcy court at a given time. Alan, talk to me a little bit about the organization of data capture, sort of the data flows in the Framingham Heart Study. Presumably you've got clinicians that are geographically distributed. It's been going on a long time, so obviously much of the records have to have been in paper. But how does that happen now? And to what extent are you able to enforce some standardization in the data capture and transfer?
I don't think it's quite the example you're looking for, because Framingham is actually a single site.
Oh, it is single site.
A single site, and so everyone there is monitored closely. There are quality control checks that are done, so that if someone has a digit preference in the way they measure blood pressure, then they get taken out the back and retrained to be completely random. And so it's progressively coming into more of an electronic model now. One of the problems there is with that is that, like, you would want your ECG or something to go straight in there, but various vendors have proprietary interfaces, and they won't really tell what the specifications are to allow those to be integrated into the databases. So there's some standardization that needs to be done right down at the instrument level that's not currently available. And so in terms of the records, traditionally each exam was stored as its own database, and then it was very hard to get to each examination, and all the variables were named. All the measurements were given different variable names. So blood pressure at exam 1 may be A variable A21, and then exam 2 may be B321. And so, in terms of trying to actually just get across those barriers, it's been a little bit challenging. But with the tools now, the new software tools now, it's relatively easy to do that. And, sort of projecting forward, you have to think that you can take your credit card and be recognized instantly wherever you are in the world, and you've been profiled ahead of time. So, in terms of being able to access your money, then you have that permission. And in a similar way, in terms of being able to access data in a secure manner, which is what this study relies upon, it's possible to credential people to do that correctly. And so that's one of the things that is key to this whole process.
Yes. You make an important point there, that even within an institution, the data systems are fragmented, that the chief of radiology will go out and buy the very best radiology information system, which may not talk all of that well to the lab or the pharmacy system within the institution, let alone across institutions. Now, in other domains, we've developed a range of information tools that start to reconcile that. Data mining kinds of technologies that are in wide use, for instance, in the financial industry. To what extent, particularly now, if you add in the components of genetic information, some of the large genetic research databases, as well as increasing amounts of genetic information attached to individuals' clinical records, to what extent are those tools going to be useful, and how do you think they will be applied both for research and in clinical practice?
So in terms of adding genetic data into the equation, I think that one of the areas that we've been very focused on is around helping institutions work to develop biobanking strategies. And Anne, did she talk a little bit about
She talked a little bit about that, but not everybody who's here now was there then, so you may want to
Okay.
sort of reintroduce the topic.
So this whole question of what we would call biobanks has become, I think, a very, very hot topic, and so a biobank is it's a repository And we think of it as both a physical repository of collected samples, but it's also a repository of information about some set of patients. And typically what people are looking at is to really gain advantageous ability to kind of pull out important, valuable information. You want to create the largest repository from the largest number of patients that you can. So you're looking at anywhere from thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands, or some people talk about millions of patient records in a biobank. So there's all kinds of issues from a biobanking perspective about tissue bank, tissue handling, sample handling, but then there's also issues around information handling. And this is where actually what we see people most want to do, although you can do lots of things with a biobank, is to combine phenotypic data and genotypic data. That's where people start to get really, really excited about the capability here. Now, what I see is that I see that primarily in a research setting, okay? People will say, well, when and how does that get to the clinic? I think that what a biobank is going to help you to do, it's going to be a very primary vehicle that people are going to use to identify biomarkers that associate with disease, and that can be used either for identification of new targets, new drug targets, but also arguably one of the ways that it'll be used is to identify and correlate sort of best treatment to and best outcome to a patient's sort of individual, I'll call it state function, and that state function has to do with their germline genetics, their current expression levels, their environment, and so how do you make those correlations happen? I think that that's going to be always done in a research model. But once you have markers and you have kind of known ways to correlate or cluster individuals into, say, this is the particular type of liver cancer that a person has. We have more ways to segment disease and patients into those segmentations. Then I think you have to package to get out to, what I'll call ordinary physicians, people who are not sort of scientist physicians. You're going to have to package that with a diagnostic, with a, really kind of make it simple and slipstream it into the way a physician works. So I don't actually see that analytical tools and sophisticated computational tools are going to be used directly at the point of care. I think they're going to be embedded in diagnostic capability that's easy to use, that's more like a black box for the doctor. But that's how they'll get there. And Affymetrix might want to comment on that as well, because you guys have a lot of stuff going on there. I was thinking about something else for a minute there. So oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Ellen, did you want to add?
Yeah. The point is that with the density of genotypic information that you can get on a person now, there's no way that you can de-identify that genetic information. In terms of research data sets, there's no way that you can send out a de-identified data set with 100,000 SNPs and say that this person can never be identified, because that's just not true. And so in terms of coming back to HIPAA, it will actually mean that the limited data set will have to be associated with the data distribution agreement. But on the other hand, sort of another side of that too is that suddenly that patient's record has value. And so potentially, we were talking about this last night, potentially you can create a market in which people can transport their medical records around between health providers if they so desire, and there may be some incentives involved with that. But also the other thing they may want to do is if they have an affiliation, if they have a particular disease, or they want to find out what it is to be an Irish American or something, they can make their medical records available to research entities and provide the license. It's just a different way of setting up a clinical population that wouldn't be possible prior to HIPAA, prior to having all the data standards.
Yes. Yoka, I'd like to come to you because Carol just posed a fairly interesting problem talking about tissue banks or specimen banks. And if I understand that world correctly, it reflects what we've been talking about in healthcare, that tissue specimens tend to be gathered idiosyncratically by pathologists, consented and annotated in ways that are peculiar to the institutional review boards in a particular institution, that the data systems that characterize those tissue banks are again, fragmented. What you said, your overall rubric is the non-proprietary approaches to provisioning problems. This seems like a classic provisioning problem. And what's your diagnosis of that? And I'll add that the pathologists hang on to those samples for dear life.
Well, I have to say I'm more pessimistic about the 3-year standardization than Carol is, because for a variety of reasons. One of them has to do with the fact that some of the drivers for implementing information technology at the particular institutional level have to do with squeezing costs out that have to do more with patient care than with and sort of managing the patient through a system than with generating clinical research data, and certainly then generating outcomes research-based accountability of the institution vis-a-vis other standards of practice. So you basically have these at least 3 types of data that revolve around the patient, that have very different incentives attached to them and very different agents actually collecting the data. So
You actually forgot billing. That's
how could I forget billing?
Well, billings are, and I would point out that billing's already electronic. Why? Because there's money there.
Well, because there's money there, but it also is an example of the problem of standardizing what happens with the data that flows around a particular patient in a way that will standardize not only across these different functions within an institution, but across institutions, some of which may have outcomes researchers, other which may not. Some of which may have clinical researchers, other of which may not. So there are strong drivers against standardization within these systems. And that's before you go to look at all the standards literature that says that even when you do have incentives, if you don't have government-imposed standards, and you don't have basically Microsoft taking a market and imposing a standard, then sometimes you get standards and sometimes you don't. And both of those are stable equilibria where you have industries underperforming for years relative to what they could because they're segmented by competing standards, and each one tries to capture its own market segment. And it's very easy to see a path where a number of IT firms compete for squeezing the greatest patient care cost efficiencies possible at the institutional level, but then don't translate that into standardization for cross-institutional accountability.
At the systemic level.
Which doesn't even touch the HIPAA problem that Alan raised, which is if you're going to, say, use data mining on a data set that was collected for patient care purposes in order to produce research purposes, and you haven't consented everyone in this particular way, that's a regulatory framework optimized for insurance billing and patient privacy, not for outcomes research.
Yeah, and so I agree with everything you said. I think this is going to be a huge challenge. But I would say that I think that some of the David Brailer initiatives around, as I think you all know, David Brailer is the health information technology czar who was named by the president in Health and Human Services last year. And some of the initiatives that he's driven around, around asking people sort of, what do we need here? What do we need to have? You probably are aware that recently there was an RFI that he put out asking about standardization and interoperability. He got over 1,000 responses to that. One of the responses was actually a consortium of companies that included IBM, but also included Microsoft and HP and Cisco, I believe, and many of the sort of large IT, not the health IT companies, but the IT, more core infrastructure IT companies. That's called the Interoperability Consortium. We wrote a report. It's a couple hundred pages long about what does interoperability need to look like. And to me, that's a little encouraging. And it's not different in a lot of respects from what the IT industry has been able to do many, many times. Okay, Microsoft example, to the side. And in fact, if you look at the internet, right, you had a lot of players coming to the table and saying, this will be pre-competitive. We can collaborate around a common standard. It's good for everybody. All boats rise. Now, I've actually had the privilege of kind of working with some of the health IT vendors, the Siemens and the GEs and the McKessons and the Cerners, and I would say to you that there's a little bit more of a, I'm all for standards as long as I'm the winner, right? But I would say that even in that community, I am seeing a real recognition that we should collaborate, that again, it's good for everybody. And the example that's been brought to me is DICOM. Okay, when medical imaging needed to have a standard, it was actually GE and Siemens and others who came together. It wasn't a forced standard. It wasn't a government-imposed standard. It was an industry-led standard by companies who competed fiercely and continued to do so with one another, who came and said, this thing just isn't going to work if we can't have a standard interface. So that's the source of my hope is that people are starting to say that's what we need here. So
Yeah.
so maybe I'm
Although companies have been coming together for 15 years at least around health information, saying exactly the same thing. HL7, for example. I'd like to shift the conversation now, actually, from talking about the infrastructure, the information infrastructure, to talking more about the intellectual property infrastructure. And at several junctures here, we've heard that knowledge contains value, data contains value, be it patient databases, be it intellectual property about processes and procedures, be it the intellectual property for some of the underlying technologies. And Phil and Yochai, in your introductions, I think that you posited two fundamentally different approaches to managing intellectual property. And ultimately, I guess what we all want is to maximize innovation in genetic research. And my question to you is really what is each of your models? A patent-driven model, an open source-driven model. What is that model, and how does it contribute to innovation? Phil?
So as I was saying, most of my job is to get patents. And it's not just to preclude people from doing things, but it's also to try to ensure that the company has freedom of operation to do the things that we're trying to do, whether it's to make arrays or to help people use bioinformatics tools. That's a little easier when you're dealing with more discrete area that's not as fragmented as you were discussing earlier. It's work for Affymetrix, and it's work for other companies like ABI in the genomics and proteomics area. You could probably name quite a few other companies that haven't focused so much on this, and they're not doing so well. TiVo, I think, was mentioned as an example last night. But it doesn't really work in every sphere. The broader you seem to get, the more fragmented you're going to get. And so it's more difficult to just satisfy the need for protection virtually by one model. And it's also probably more difficult to ensure freedom of operation. In the genomics and content area, you have people who have tried to establish a business model based on patents and patenting DNA or proteins, and that hasn't been very successful. And so one has to look a little more creatively to determine what ways you could help innovation and ensure that people can do some research and development in various areas that are going to be broader. Patents aren't typically the ones you would use to try to enable broadly people's right to do research. And other mechanisms could involve things like patent pools, which it gets a little bit to what Carol was speaking about, standards and people getting together to try to set forth something that was common amongst different groups. Research exemptions have been discussed in the past. Research exemptions for just pure research as done by universities, and court cases have suggested or confirmed that there isn't really much of a research exemption. You could talk about another type of research exemption, which is the clinical research exemption. Again, the same court has narrowed that, although the Supreme Court of the United States is going to be hearing arguments regarding that as well. There have been proposed legislation for research exemptions, and currently there's nothing that's going forward right now, although several have been proposed. For patent pools, it's worked pretty well for a variety of different industries, and historically, federal government has suggested patent pools for things like airplanes during World War II because people just weren't advancing the research and science. Sewing machines is another example. It's a little more mundane, but radios as well. And in the current environment, things in the non-biotech area have been CDs and DVDs and MPEG, which have established patent pools so that people could freely do research and development. And there was another patent pool in laser keratotomy. It's not exactly biotech, but it's kind of a closer example, and proposed patent pools for both SARS and HIV so that people could do what you would obviously expect, more research and advance the science of diagnostics there. Patent pools sometimes, well, they have the advantages of coordinating and enabling people across a broad spectrum of things that, that the patent pool is more or less describing. They have not so much problems, but the broader base the technology is, like in consumer electronics, the more likely you'll have participation because people will see the economic benefit. Ultimately, if you have less of an economic benefit potentially in the biotech area, then you'd have to have more of an incentive, and I think Carol had spoken about incentives to reward people, so at Yohai. And for incentives, one potential structure of a patent pool could be where people who participate in the patent pool would be entitled to a research royalty-free license, a royalty-free research license. And that would encourage contribution by people who have patents or other intellectual property in the area, and then they would be compensated when ultimately the patent pool licenses people for commercial use. Sometimes there are some antitrust implications when competitors join forces, but standard setting is one way to get around that, and there could be other ways as well. Convenience certainly reduces transaction costs because you can imagine the difficulty would be to go to 10, 12 different universities and companies to try to get rights under similar patents. Another possible mechanism would be compulsory licensing, and compulsory licensing has been mentioned. It's more like a forced patent pool. You'd still have a little difficulty potentially in grouping people and going forward that way, but it would be a mechanism that would clear the way for people to do research and development in various areas. The downsides to that is that it's not very well established here in the United States. Different countries have a little bit more formal policy. It's usually a balance between the individual private interests and the government interest, and of course you can see that in certain healthcare areas you'd have a pretty strong governmental interest. There is some legislation in TRIPS, in Articles I think 30 and 31, that more or less provide some framework for compulsory licensing, although it's not, as I said, not well established here in the United States. You've seen some aspects of that when we had 9/11 and people were starting to discuss the forced governmental rights for making the antibiotic Cipro, when people thought there was going to be a fairly high need for manufacturing more antibiotic because of terrorist attacks. So all those three different proposals, aren't right there and available, but patent pools are a little bit more available, and some of the other parts I think need some further work to fall into place.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to highlight that this is curious. I'm supposed to be the one, the way you structured it, this was the most pro-patent-based system. Patent pools, compulsory licensing, and government march-in. In other words, there are problems. Patents present a series of problems. And I think it's important to step a moment back and just in 3.5 words explain why. Right? Patents are a particular, and we use the term intellectual property a lot. It's a bad term, right? Because it assumes that the economics of patents and copyrights and trademarks and exclusive data rights are all the same, which they're not. It assumes that they're all roughly the same as real estate property and property in wristwatches and automobiles, which they certainly are not. So it's important to bring ourselves back to use the proper terms. These are specific regulatory systems for specific industrial innovation systems. Patents is one of them. All of the patents, copyrights have a certain characteristic, which is they regulate entry into use of particular information in an industrial sector in order to give the person who innovated first some period of exclusivity, more or less limited, to be able to capture rents from being the only person in the market. Now, this causes well-recognized and well-known problems with underutilization of things that are under patent. And underutilization comes in two major flavors. One is, let's think of it as lack of access to medicines in Africa. They're just too expensive for consumption, but that's true also of the person who is willing to listen to music for half an hour and pay their time, but not willing to pay the $15 because basically making the copy is costless. It would be, in a static analysis, efficient for them to access at the marginal cost of their attention, but we don't give it to them because we think people won't produce music if you don't pay them the $15 for the disc. But it would be inefficient. That's less important, I think, in the context of biotechnology. The more important aspect is information of all forms is both input and output of its own production process. So some underutilization, some inefficient underutilization that is a necessary component of patents, and we know that it's a necessary component of patents, is underutilization as input into new creation. Now this is true across all forms of innovation. It's particularly true, as we see now in biotechnology, because of the extent to which we're innovating in things that are primarily inputs into second and third generation innovation. So we're using a system, one of whose characteristics we know is to restrict access of downstream innovators to upstream information outputs in an area where much of the output is precisely primarily as input into downstream innovation. We're using it at a place where it's weakest, at the broad basic economic modeling of the functioning of patents.
Can you give an example in this domain of that upstream-downstream relationship, just to make it a little more concrete?
Golden rice was an example where in order to actually bring an end product that would have the enhanced nutritional characteristics of delivering beta-carotene in rice required something like 70 different patents of components that went both into research and into delivery and into actually producing the genetically modified rice, that required over 40 patent holders to come to some agreement and created some substantial time lag between when it was clear how the thing could be done and when it was possible to actually produce a grain of rice that could deliver beta-carotene and save X hundreds of thousands of kids a year. So we're in that area. Now, with regard to step back. There have been a series of survey studies of industrial R&D across sectors starting in 81, and the most recent one is 2000, 2001, that have asked across industries, what are your models of appropriating the value of your innovation? How important are patents to your overall strategy? And it turns out that there are only 2 or 3 industrial sectors where patents are considered to be most important. That's pharmaceuticals, and remember this is a time where we're talking primarily small molecules, and therefore also in chemicals and medical devices. To some extent, this was reported. All other industrial sectors, issues of who was first to market, internalized efficiencies of production from having better know-how, the ability to have better marketing relationships because you were more innovative. These were considered much more important ways of appropriating the benefits of innovation. So if you look at IBM and its relationship to Linux, I have a graph on my computer that I don't have here that I never asked them permission. I use the publicly available information as input into my own information production. Looking at their annual reports on one hand and their public announcement about revenues from 2000 to 2003, the relationship between their patent royalty, licensing, and sales, and they're the biggest patent holder in the United States, and their revenue from what they call Linux-related services. And in 2000, you've got a little over $1 billion worth of patent royalties, et cetera, and 0 from Linux-related sales. In 1 year, the gap shrinks. In the past couple of years, Linux-related services have been a larger source of revenue than all patent and royalty payments to the owner of the largest patent portfolio in the country. And the reason is that they sell servers, they sell relationships and customization, they sell particular solutions optimized, and they are using the software as a better, cheaper input into that other thing that they're doing downstream. So before we even touch open source innovation, patents are a problem in this area because they are operating in an area where the primary innovation output is itself primarily input into new research, which is analytically a very weak place for patent to operate, and because very often, this is a more tentative statement, situations where access to materials and know-how will be sufficient barriers for an early mover to prevent competition, and therefore to be able, for example, for a biotech to sell into a pharma, being able to bring over the people and their know-how and their materials may be sufficient in order to capture the value without the added cost of a patent that won't let them sell themselves for more, but will prevent the 5 other companies working on something related from doing what they're supposed to do.
Before we come to open source, I'd like to give Carol an opportunity to comment on this as well.
Well, I just wanted to comment that one of the things that's kind of interesting is you talked about kind of this upstream, downstream issue, and you used golden rice as an example. And in the IT industry, what's evolved is a very, very different mindset and valuation around patents. In fact, you know, as I'm sure you well know, Yochai, IBM doesn't use its patent portfolio, big as it is, to try to keep other people out of markets. In fact, you know, the primary purpose of our patent portfolio always was and still is far beyond the $1 billion of licensing revenue that we get. We would estimate that we get probably $5 billion of valuation around cross-licensing. So in the IT industry, all of our portfolio that relates to information technology is widely cross-licensed with every one of our major competitors. Now, that doesn't necessarily include, you know, small startup kinds of companies, but what it does mean is that, you know, if you, I mean, we know we need to have pieces of other people's intellectual property portfolio or patent portfolio specifically to make our stuff, and they need ours. So there's this kind of, you know, it's kind of like a, you know, a Cold War, I guess, and you know, where you sort of, you get patents in order to be able to trade with other guys who have patents but you never actually then wind up wanting to use them against one another. You just want to allow freedom of action. And I know that in this world, we're talking about a totally different world, but is this whole idea of broader cross-licensing among major participants one solution perhaps to this issue around siloing the rights?
Yeah. Phil? Well, I was just going to say that the situation on the golden rice seemed to be problematic because it was fragmented. And with in just looking at our company, it is not as fragmented because the area is a little smaller. And so also for the example that you'd given about the value being captured in terms of going to market, I think it's a good point too. Because that's where our people see. They see patents as a complement, more or less to ensure our freedom of operation in the way that Carol described, and also to more or less let the people who are out there designed to do the sales get to market quicker, won't be more or less overrun by larger companies. And the example with the IBM, they have the benefit of being very, very large, and when we started, we were very, very small. And some of our competitors were pretty large companies. And so one way, more or less, to establish a little clearing before we got a critical mass was to ensure that we had some patents out there.
Alan?
Yeah, just coming back to the genetic age of understanding human disease, I know a lot of participants aren't interested in having these findings based on their contributions patented. And there's a question whether that should even be a consideration.
Yes, I think that's the right segue into just a brief framing, Yochai, of the role of open source in this domain, and then I would like to go to the audience for some of their questions.
Just one thing to emphasize. When it's the case, and it is the case, this 2000 survey that Wes Cohen did across all industrial segments, the constant statement was, we don't do this to license. We do this so that nobody will hold us up. Well, that means that as a general policy matter, we are taking a particular tool that's useful for 1 or 2 or 3 industrial segments, and we're imposing it as a business cost on all of these industrial sectors. If tomorrow you knew for sure that there would be multilateral disarmament from patents, so you would have access to your neighbor's technology and they would have yours, but without the licensing, but without the lawyering fees and the patent seeking fees, you would be $1 billion a year better off? I don't know, but some amount, certainly the entire segment. So that's important. There's the baseline. I think it's very important to emphasize what Alan emphasized, which is this is also an area where enormous amount of innovation is coming from people and institutions that aren't looking to make money from what they're doing. They're doing it because it's interesting. They're doing it because it's important. And they're doing it within institutions that our society has that are designed specifically to make room for people who do things because they think they're important and interesting, not because they're going to make money from them. And we've had a very effective innovation system by giving space to both. And when you have a very strong patent system, it imposes costs on IBM, but it's harder still when it imposes costs on sectors that don't actually make money from patenting. Now to your question. Open source techniques are a form of legal jujitsu. They basically take the power of copyright in the context of software, patent in the context of these new efforts to transpose the basic transaction flow of open source onto biotechnology, and say, here, you may use my technology. In exchange, I don't want you to pay me something. I might, but I don't want you to pay me something. I want you to be able to use this freely under one condition, or the most important condition, or multiple conditions. The most important condition. When you improve, when you innovate, you will do what I am doing. You will let everyone innovate on your improvement in the same way that I'm allowing you to innovate on mine. And this is very different from the traditional public domain model where I don't want to make money from this here. public. You do whatever you want with it, which also means that some segment of those firms who do have to respond to shareholders and do have to make money then take that for free and enclose it. Don't contribute what they took out of the public domain and improve back into the public domain. The
So
basic
hence-
model of open source is, here, use it, but give it back. Give back what you've created in addition.
So hence, in the software world, the various flavors of Unix that evolved were maybe an example of that, the model that you just cited. You put it out in the public domain, people put a box around it and evolve it in a more proprietary way.
Unix has this ambiguous history where at some points it was maybe in the public domain and then maybe not. Unix specifically is a bit more ambiguous than that, but certainly there's a period at which Unix is out there in a sense that's pretty much public domain, and then they try to pour it back in the bottle and say, no, actually it was under license, and it's complicated.
I'm sorry then, to bring it back to the genetic age, maybe you can tell us a bit about BIOS and the model there.
Okay, BIOS is an effort that's headed by Richard Jefferson of Cambia in Australia. And the basic idea there is to take a number of central innovations, put them into a pool, a patent pool of a particular form, which then anyone can use to develop their own improvements if they put it back into the pool. In the particular case, last week, they had published finding 3 different kinds of bacteria that can transfer genes into plants in a way that is not as good as agrobacterium now, but in a way that is free of the patents that currently control use of agrobacterium. So they basically created an early version enabling technology for gene transfer into plants, and they put them into this BIOS pool, this open source pool, under a set of licensing provisions that basically says, you can use this. You can use this to create improvements in things that are not required for the research but are end products, and then patent the end product and sell them. So the point is not to create a situation where end products are not patentable, but rather to create a context where if you want this for your research, you must give whatever improvements you have back into this pool purely for purposes of research. And they've been working now for a while to get adoption by some of the major agricultural biotech firms. The idea is not to create, and in this regard, I think it would be problematic to have an ethos that characterizes at least some of the free software community of anti-Microsoft. In this case, it seems to be the push is much more cooperative, much more emphasizing the fact that the set of problems created by patents in biotechnology are suffered basically by anyone who plays in this game, whether they end up being academics or nonprofits or patent-based for-profits. So the idea is to seed a patent pool with a particular characteristic, which is anyone, not only the people who contribute, anyone can do research on the things that are in the pool if they then contribute back into it any improvements that they have, but it has boundaries. You can then take things and appropriate them if it's not research and the ability and not research inputs that you're appropriating, if it's end products.
Good, thank you. I'd like to open it now for your comments and questions to the panel. Yes. If you could identify yourself, please.
Arthur Hand, University of Connecticut Health Center. Just one question about the patient source of material that is used for research and development. There were some issues a number of years ago at UCLA, I think, about development of products based on one individual's cells. How does that fit into the equation here? Should that be should individuals have the right to benefit from material that they contribute, or what's the thinking of the panel on that?
Well, in California, there was a case called Moore versus Regions of California, in which somebody had basically gone to the doctor, and the doctor had taken out some cells, and eventually it was patented. I think, well, at least the product of those cells was patented as GCSF, and that, of course, was a multi-million-dollar industry, as patented by Amgen and others. So Moore had sued for some monetary gain here. And ultimately, the court said, you know, he had signed a release in that case, you know, allowing the doctor to perform research and to use his cells. Essentially, he was trying to discard his cells, much like you would if you were thinking of it as garbage. And he didn't have a financial interest there, but there was a side issue with the case in that the doctor did some extra procedure that wasn't governed by the consent that he'd given. So just in California, it's okay for you to go ahead and sign away your rights to various things that are, you know, part of your body or cell line. You can get into some other issues there, but for that narrow reason, it was determined that he was not an owner of the proprietary rights that flowed from that.
It also goes to a wider issue too on like observational studies whether participants have any expectation of any benefit accruing to themselves through participating, and the bottom line is that they don't. You know, just because the research, the information that they contributed and the genetic information they contributed led to a finding that this gene causes that disease, doesn't entitle them to a right to be informed of that finding at all, you know, except through the public mechanisms, through publication or through something else. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that participants need to understand about research. It's research, and if something is found that doesn't accrue a benefit to them, it's a benefit to society as a whole.
There are two pushbacks on this from outside the U.S. We have a very efficiency and innovation-centric view of these problems. The European directive on this is more vague about the extent to which national laws can or should give people who are the sources of genetic material some right. There's a good bit of push from the developing world under a broad umbrella of traditional knowledge and in general the resistance of being a passive resource for extraction as opposed to understood as an active participant in the creation. And there's some push now spearheaded last year by Brazil and Argentina to be pushing towards a development agenda in the World Intellectual Property Organization. Those are two sources of pushback, but certainly if you're looking at the United States itself, we tend to think of this purely in terms of how you drive innovation and how you, rather than how you recognize the particular contribution of particular individuals or ethnic groups.
You know, I would just say that that especially in a world where we're looking at a lot of value accruing from the ability to aggregate lots of patient information in these biobanks that I was talking about, it will be a disaster if patients individual patients demand, you know, to be sort of tied directly to value, and if we can't find a way to get patients to participate voluntarily in these, you know, sort of really profoundly important, I think, research tools. And I would say that, you know, when patients are asked, will you, do you consent to have your information and your tissues used for research purposes? When they say yes, the reason they say yes is out of a very, very good intention, which is to help other people. And what they want to see back, the benefit that they see back, is that they think, you know, in a small way, maybe I can help cure this disease so that the next person who comes along will have a cure. when they turn around then and see the institution that they gave this to making money out of it, I think that, you know, that's going to pose a really serious challenge, and we're going to have to, and I think it's an area where we were talking earlier a little bit about, you know, sort of we need to be very, very thoughtful about making sure that patients understand kind of what's going to happen with this, with their data and with their samples, because it will be a terrible thing if they turn around, and it's easy to envision this happening, and you know, and you see on the front page in the New York Times, you know, what those terrible people did by, you know, at the University of so-and-so, selling data that came from these patients who volunteered it for the good of science.
Yeah,
It's going to be a big thing.
Actually, I want to get one more question here.
Well, Sheila Jasanoff, Harvard University Kennedy School of Government. Actually, is it Dr. Hand who asked that question? I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on it, and Dr. Benkler went in the direction that I was wanting you to go. I mean, this isn't just a matter, is it, of a particular idea of the market and how it operates that we want to, you know, promote in the world. The point you raised about the European and developing country pushbacks suggests that that the word value has a couple of different meanings here, and monetary value accruing to particular people who control a market structure is only one part of it. There are other values involved as well. And you know, it's interesting that the metaphor of the bank should be used, because the individual contributors to a bank by all means expect return on their personal investment in it. And so Carol's notion that contributors to biobanks should somehow be different from contributors to ordinary, you know, Fleet or Bank of America banks, you know, there's something a little bit funny there. So I was wondering, you know, the word ethics didn't actually make it into this discussion. In European discussions on intellectual property, ethics is there, and there's a notion that somewhere boundaries have to be set between what the market demands in terms of efficiency and what ethical principles demand in the way of various people's access. The PXE model in this country, where in fact the donors do have a share in the intellectual property rights, is an American example that does some of the things that the Europeans are asking for. So I'm just curious, you know, where do you people, all four of you, see, if you see at all, a place for ethics and ethical questions to be entering into this discussion of, you know, what the public ought to believe is their right in biobanks and so on and so forth? Do you see that as an irrelevant discussion?
Oh, not in the least. I mean, just, you know, not in the least. In fact, it's kind of, what I was trying to say, you did it much better than I did. You know, what I was trying to say before is that I think it is very much time for a discussion around ethics and ownership and what patient rights will be. I mean, HIPAA is just kind of scratches the surface about saying, you know, you can't tell anybody who I am, you know, and I'll, you know, I'll let you have this, but you can't tell anybody who I am. But now we're looking in a world where, you know, different kinds of value, but real monetary value is going to accrue back to the use of this. And I think that it's going to raise a whole other set of issues, and it needs discussion. And by the way, I mean, in the areas where we had those discussions in biosciences early, as I was saying to someone earlier, you know, like around recombinant DNA, that actually, you know, you could do the right set of things in the areas where we were late to those discussions and did not consider the rights of, and the not even just rights, but mindset of individuals, like agricultural biosciences. I mean, it set the whole field back from the perspective of commercialization and adoption, at least in some parts of the world. So, I mean, I think that's very much a danger here, is that the whole field of, you know, getting data, getting valuable information out of aggregations of patient data will be set back a lot if we don't address those issues. So I think you're exactly right.
Alan?
Yeah, I think should be partly informed consent as to where the data ends up, who has access to it, and what happens to the findings. And we wrestle with this whole issue about if we, in our genomic studies, find out genes that are patentable or very useful, how to deal with that. And in the end, what we decided is that putting it out in the public domain and making it available to a wide number of companies who can start from the same starting line and innovate through developing either better drugs or better tests is a formulation that participants are happy with. They don't mind some companies profiting as long as the whole process is accelerated, so the findings are translated into either diagnosis or treatment, and they see that as a reasonable solution.
You're right.
The ethics, as you know better than I, are complicated. But one of the problems is that often when we talk about ethics and ownership in human tissue, in genes, is that it focuses on something like the way that the Moore case was structured, was human dignity and objectification and that relationship. And what we get, and that without limiting the importance of that, we get less of a conversation on the ethics of the organization of innovation production as a system. And that goes exactly, I think, to what Carol was talking about in her initial back and forth even before. It matters whether my materials as an individual are part of an innovation system that I understand to be a collective sharing endeavor of humanity to make our lives better, than if I understand my tissues to be inserted into a rent maximization system based on patents. So if you look, for example, at the difference between some of the efforts to push traditional knowledge licensing and access to biodiverse ecosystems by pharmaceuticals, these tend to focus on, here's the kind of payments you're going to need to make. If you look at the Berkeley-Samoa Memorandum of Understanding from a few months ago, where Berkeley and the government of Samoa entered into a Memorandum of Understanding of using particular materials extracted from a number of Samoans, it was much more focused on securing recognition of the fact that this is part of a collective effort to improve treatment of diseases, and that to the extent there would be fund flows, it wasn't about funds to the individuals. It was about assuring that the fund flows go to the collective effort of improving access to medicines in the developing world. So there's an ethical argument that has to do with individuals, but there's also an ethical argument that has to do with the overall structure of the system and the extent to which we understand the commercial proprietary system as playing a limited but important role in driving what we understand in a more systematic way as a human endeavor to improve the quality of medicine across the world.
Good, thanks. Phil?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can add too much to what Yochai's said. It's hard to follow him. He's already covered most of everything. However, it does show that patents are difficult to really capture, whatever you want to call it, capture the idea here because of, one, how do you determine whether it's an invention or not, if it's simply inherent in somebody's genes? And you know, it shows that it's complicated, and it shows that it would exacerbate the fragmentation that goes on and all the things we've been discussing, and that you know, maybe somebody needs to recalculate on whether or not some of these natural products should be patented in that state.
Good. Thank you all very, very much. I'd like to, before I ask you to join me in thanking the panel, signal that we have another panel in this Genetic Age series on the economics of health and its relation to genetics coming up at 1:45, and then at 3:30 a panel on regulation, public confidence, and ethics. We'll have 3 ethicists present there. So if this segment of the discussion interested you, you may want to come back at 3:30. Now I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking this panel for a job very well done. Thank you.